So yeah, it's 3:15, so let's get started. This is my session on introducing the Access Policy API into Drupal core. I'm Christian van den Ende. I work at Factorial. It's a really awesome place to work. And I have a handle on Twitter. You can try and reach me there. I won't do anything because I really don't use it anymore. But if I release something like group-wise or something, I tend to send out a tweet. So nowadays that's like once every year. I wish it was more. I'm the author and the maintainer of the group module, the group sites module, and some others. And I'm the maintainer of course cache and user subsystem. Not the maintainer, co-maintainer. Like cache has catch and user has mosh also. And I'm a highly sensitive person. I put that at the front of all of my presentations. It basically means that there's this little thing in my brain that makes all of my senses go haywire. So yeah, I've got a ton of issues. Like you should see my suitcase. I'm surprised they didn't pull me over because of all the medication that was in there. But yeah, so that's my life. It means that I might start hyperventilating all of a sudden, start feeling dizzy, all sorts of stuff. It's just something I have to accept. But I do put it out there so that if something does happen during the session, it's most likely not a heart attack. And I always crack the same joke. Please do check, you know, in case it is, but it's probably not. So, why access policies? A short history lesson, because obviously I cannot explain what the access policy API is without first explaining why we actually have that. So, it used to be that if we wanted to give someone permissions in core, we had two scenarios. Either you were user one and you had an access pass for everything, or we gave you certain roles, and based on those roles, you would get permissions. Now, those actually sort of have a name. Like it's because you're user one, that's an attribute on your account, so that is sort of like attribute-based access control. And because you get roles, you get access, that is sort of like role-based access control. But I'm saying sort of because not really. If it's pure attribute-based access control, it would mean that based on that attribute, you get access. And with user one, sometimes it was because we were directly checking for your UID. But with roles, it's not. We don't check for roles. If you do, that's really bad. You really shouldn't. I know some people do, please don't. But with roles, it's basically we check the permissions against your roles. So while it is a form of role-based access control, it's actually like a permission-based access control, which leans pretty closely to policies, like policy-based access control. But that's all we had. So how we check for access, like how you perhaps, if you haven't read up on the access policy API yet, how you perhaps visualize that, that we check access in core is, for instance, on a route, we have this permission check. And on a view, we have this permission plugin. And then in an annotation for an entity type, perhaps. Or just in your own code, you do this like user has permission. And we have many more of those. Now, while I was developing the group module, I came to a point where I needed to alter this. I wanted to make it so that people couldn't just create nodes everywhere, but only in particular groups, for instance. So I needed to alter this. And I had a really hard time getting this done because the question is, how do we alter these? It's scattered all over. So if we have like 5 different places where we're checking for a particular node create permission, I'd have to chase that down and go to all 5 places and then put in my extra condition. And then, God forbid, someone enables another module that also checks for that permission, and I'm screwed again. So I really had no idea how to fix this, and then it hit me. You know, I want to change my set of permissions, and I can't possibly know all of these places. So I need to do something to that set of permissions, right? So that when all of these places check for permissions, I can add some extra in there. And I thought about changing someone's user roles during the requests. Don't do that. It's a security risk, I found out. So don't do that. And the gist of it is that we have a user.permissions cache context, which relies on your roles. And if you change those during a request, then the outcome of that cache context might change, and then you're screwed. because you might be showing or caching the wrong stuff. So don't do that. So what we actually want, and this is really cool, is that let's say I have this website and I'm like the manager of a small office and I'm really kind to my employees and I don't want them to be working outside of office hours, right? So I want to set up my website so that during office hours, they can do their job. They can edit stuff from module X, they can delete stuff from module X, do stuff for module Y, Z, whatever, right? And then I'm like, do I really want that? Because deleting stuff is quite destructive. So maybe I only want them to delete stuff if they have two-factor authentication on their account. So I want to revoke those permissions to delete, so that only when they have two-factor authentication, I wouldn't do anything and I wouldn't revoke those. And that got me thinking, if you look at this, like I have a condition and then I have a list of permissions, or I have a condition and then I have a list of permissions that I want to revoke. We actually already have that in core. We do. It's user roles. If you have a particular role, you get a list of permissions. Or it's the same with admin roles. If you have an admin role, you get all the permissions. I don't know if you've ever checked this, but inside the user role, we have a check that checks for the admin flag. And if you have that admin flag, we don't care which permissions you had or were looking for. We just say, yeah, you have access. And that was the same case for user one. And this total set of like these columns, these green columns with all of these permissions, that is actually your complete set of user permissions. So the two on the left, we obviously don't have yet. But the fact that I said that got me thinking is, well, it does look quite similar, doesn't it? So what if we created a system that converted what we had on the right into something more generic so that we can do the things on the left, right? And that's how the Access Policy API was born. So I stopped banging my head against the wall by trying to change user roles on the fly, and I just said, okay, let's take it up one level to something more generic and then see what we can do with that. So how does that work under the hood? Because before I explain what access policies are, we need to somehow convey that information that I just showed you, those columns of permissions, and we need to be able to convey that across all of Drupal so that anyone can read from it, right? So the top part is basically your access policy. That is your condition. So I'm not going to show that just yet. That's for later during this talk. But the bottom part we need to represent. That green list of permissions, or perhaps red list of permissions, needs to be represented. So we are working with a bunch of value objects, and 3 value objects in total, but 2 out of them will be immutable. Immutable, for those who don't know, means that you cannot change anything about it. It's basically read-only. And it's really important that it's read-only, because once again, if we're going to sort of like replace this system of user roles with objects that we're passing around and you can change them, then we land back in the same situation. It's unsafe. You cannot change them during a request. So they have to be immutable. So first of all, we have the calculated permissions item, which is where you would store one of these columns. And I hope you can read that in the back of the room. I actually went to the back of the room earlier, and I hope, but the screen isn't that big. So the calculated permissions item is our first immutable value object, which basically represents your permissions and whether or not you're an admin. There is this little orange box there. I'm going to reveal what's behind it. It's about a scope and an identifier. And as far as this part of the talk goes, you do not need to worry about it. I will go into detail at the tail end, but right now, don't worry about it. You can see that it defaults to the scope Drupal. And that's because most of the time you won't be filling this out. Only if you're developing a module like group or domain will you be interested in these 2 parts. Most of the time, it's basically you are concerned about permissions on the Drupal level for the whole site. So that means the Drupal scope and Drupal identifier. You don't need to specify that. Then you can see that if you have passed in some permissions, but also you're an admin, we just don't store any of them. We make it an empty array, and otherwise we get to unique values. We do that because when we check for your permission, we check whether you're an admin or whether the permission that was requested is in your set of permissions. And if this looks familiar, that's because it is. This is actually the same logic as in the user role has permission methods. So again, I took this system that already existed with user roles, and we basically made it a bit more generic so that anything can use it. So that's why the logic looks the same. And then we need to grab all of these green columns that we just saw and get them into this collection. So how do we do that? Well, we have a refinable calculated permissions object. And a refinable calculated permissions object is basically just a collection of all of these. And the most important method is the one on screen, which is add item. Now, add item grabs this calculated permissions item, and then it keeps merging it in. So if you had one column with like 5 permissions, and then you pass it another calculated permissions item with a column with like 5 other permissions, then the end result would be one calculated permissions item at that address with 10 permissions. If you revoke them, you would take them out of there. So you end up with like at one address of a scope and an identifier with one item, and that would be that. Now there are obviously other methods on there because it's refinable. You can remove them. You can remove items by scope. You can remove all of them. You can merge two refinable calculated permissions into one, which loops over all of the contained items and merges them. But the most important one that you will be concerned with is add item. Now obviously this is refinable and we don't want that. Once we have all of your permissions, we want to pass those around without people having the ability to change that. So that is the calculated permissions item. The calculated permissions item implements most of the interface of the refinable the calculated permissions implements the same interface like the refinable one, except the refinable bits. And in the constructor, you would pass it a refinable one or another non-refinable one. Either way, it then grabs all of the items out of it and it gets those. But unlike the refinable one, this one doesn't have setters. This one doesn't have remove methods. It just has getters. That's everything you have. Now, again, there's another block that I sort of like blacked out or read it out, if that's a word. It's about cache context. You will see this if you dig into the code. You don't need to care about this. The essence is that internally, while we gather all of your permissions, we will be caching it using cache contexts. More on that later. But we don't want those cache contexts to bubble up to the page because the page will not vary by it. The page will still vary by your permissions. If we were to bubble all of these up, then it would be a nightmare to cache. So now we have our 3 value objects. So how do we actually go from these value objects to a complete cached set of permissions? Well, that's where the access policy processor service comes in. Now, in that service, as I already hinted at, your access policy results are cached. So this entire set, all of these green and red columns, go into that value object, and that value object gets written into a cache. Now, what happens when we don't find a cache item? So when we have a cache miss and we actually need to calculate this stuff. Well, we have 3 phases. In the first phase, we're going to go over all of the defined access policies and we're going to ask them to build permissions. These are only green columns that you saw earlier, just adding permissions. In the second phase, we're going to allow all of them to have another go at it, but this time they can add more or start removing. So this would be my 2-factor authentication case. And it's really important that we have 2 passes. I want to pause here for a second. Let's say that we only allowed people to add during one phase and I want to remove. Well, now I'm stuck in that same loop again. I need to find which of the access policies added those permissions that I want to remove, and I need to like extend or decorate that one, and it becomes a whole mess. And then you'd still have to worry about weights, like which one runs first. So we can take care of that by having 2 passes. And in only that second pass, you can start removing stuff. And then in the third pass, we ask all of these access policies, like which cache context represents the logic that you checked for to calculate your permissions. So in my first example, where I said during office hours, well, you would have to define a cache context that represents whether or not it's during office hours. That would simply return yes or no, right? So it asks each of these policies to give you those cache contexts so that we can cache the total result varying by all of these contexts. So let's have a quick look at the build phase. So you'll see in the build phase that we have a property called access policies. They're tagged services, they get collected. So we loop over all of them and we ask each policy, do you apply for a given scope? I told you not to worry about scopes and you still don't need to. This is internally in the access policy processor. You'll see in a second that you won't have to worry about that. But either way, that responds with yes or no. If it responds with no, it means that this doesn't apply. So that could be, for instance, the access policies coming from group. They don't apply to your Drupal permissions. They apply to your group permissions. And then we calculate your permissions, and you'll see that we have at the top a refinable calculated permissions object, and we will be getting a calculated permissions, refinable calculated permissions object from the access policy. So we merge those together, and we keep doing that. So every time we loop over a new access policy, we keep expanding our object. Then we have the alter phase, and just like in the build phase, again, we ask the access policies, do you care about this? And if they do, at that point, we pass it that merged object that we just built, and then they can start removing stuff from it or adding stuff to it. There is this validate scope thingy. Again, don't worry about it. You probably won't ever have to, but the gist of that is that if we are asking for permissions for the Drupal scope, and all of a sudden you return permissions for the group scope, you will face an exception, because the system will warn you saying, hey, you're doing something really strange here. And it's good that we throw that exception. And then we have that caching phase that I talked about. So again, we ask every policy, do you apply? And if so, give me your cache contexts. And then we merge those together, and we send those off with your calculated permissions to the variation cache. So how do you define an access policy? Well, we already talked about one part. We already talked about the part that you need to grant or revoke permissions, right? So I don't need to go into detail on that. But it needs to be always available. It's a service, so thankfully it's always available to Symfony and therefore to Drupal, but it also needs to always be able to answer our questions. So it needs to run on globally available data. The current user, the time of day, what place on earth you're on, perhaps even what color underwear the current user is wearing, like stuff that you can deduce from things you have in the global context. It always needs to be available. It needs to be isolated. Your access policy should not know about the other ones. So to prevent that scenario that I just talked about, where you have to play cat and mouse with existing access policies, figuring out which one added permissions and then try to revoke them, because we have this build and alter phase, you don't need to worry about that. So the code reflects that. So access policies, for instance, are final. You'll see an example of that later, but they are final because you shouldn't be meddling with other people's access policies. And they can be cached, obviously. We already discussed that part, but it's really important that if you have an access policy, that you specify how we should cache it. So you should always have a cache context that accompanies your access policy. So let's look at the base class that you can use to write your own access policy. And you'll notice that this is why I said you don't need to worry about the scope. Because when we ask whether it applies, out of the box, any access policy that extends the base class applies to the Drupal scope. So when Drupal is asking for Drupal permissions, your access policy will run. And then you'll notice that the base class will also instantiate a refinable calculated permissions object for you and immediately add the right cache context to it. So if you specify your persistent cache context at the bottom, it will immediately be added. So again, you don't need to worry about that. So let's look at an example from core. So this is the user roles access policy. This is how we now grant people permissions based on what user roles you have. So first of all, I want to point out that it is in fact final. So this is not API. If you write an access policy, you can change whatever the hell you want to it. And if people complain about that, that's their problem. It's not API. You can intervene during the alter phase, and that's how you should do it. Final does not mean that in those rare cases where you do want to change something about someone else's access policy that you can't, because you can still decorate it. Access policies are services. You could still write a decorator, and because of the really small footprint that the interface is, it's actually quite doable. But I wouldn't recommend it because it's really the goal that you write your own access policies to influence the outcome of other access policies. So let's look at the next part. So it extends that base class, and you can see that when I said that the base class creates an object for you with all the right cacheable metadata already, that's how you call that. You call the parent, and then you have your object to start with. And then we actually vary this by your user roles, because it's the user roles access policy. So if your roles change, so does the outcome of which permissions you have, right? And then we loop over all of the current, the past in accounts roles, and we basically grab each role, add that as a cacheable dependency, because if the role changes, the permissions might have changed. But you'll notice that we create this calculated permissions item for the role's permissions and or the isAdmin flag coming from that role. So it's actually really clean, and we add that to your total set, which gets shipped up to the processor, and the processor merges that in and then goes to the next access policy. Now, there is something that you may have noticed. We're using the user roles cache context, and we're passing in an account. How do we know whether that account is a current user? Because the user roles cache context only works for the current user. Well, I've got your back there, because we want access policies to be able to work with whatever whatever account is passed in, and still be able to use cache context. So there's this little piece of code in the processor that actually, as it calls the policies, it switches the current user to whatever account was passed in. So that you can, in your policy, you do get an account passed in, but you could just as easily use the current user service. But it's essentially made that way so that your cache context would work. At the end of the processing, we switch back to whoever the current user really was. So during a request for user A, you could be calculating user B's permissions, and that would be fine. That would work. And it doesn't do anything bad so far. Hopefully, it will stay that way. Now, the super user access policy is another example, and this one is really simple. You vary it by the isSuperUser cache context, which returns true or false whether or not you're user 1. And you'll notice that we again call the parent, but then if you're not user 1, we just return that value object, and it's going to be empty. It's going to have cacheable metadata, but it's going to be empty. And if you are user 1, we get to the final return statement, and there we add this empty calculated permissions item, but the isAdmin flag is set to true. And that's how the super user gets all permissions. So we still have the exact same behavior in core like we used to, but they're now access policies. Now, there's something really cool about this, because access policies are services, and this is what that looks like. So you can see that we have, do I have red lines here? Nope. I forgot to add those, but like you can see that we have a tag called access policy. That's how the processor picks them up. And then you can do whatever you want, like with a normal service. But you can see that we just declared them like this. Now, because they're services, there's something really cool. You can turn them off. And this is exactly what we did in core. We now have this flag in services.yaml where you can set security.enable superuser to false, clear your caches, and user 1 will no longer have an all access pass. This has been a pet peeve of mine for 15 years, and it's finally in. Yeah, that really deserves an applause. It took 15 years. Like the issue on Drupal.org was 54007 or something. It's like, yeah, a very tiny number, and I think I memorized it correctly. It's like crazy. So you can turn it off. Where 10.3 and 11. So starting 10.3 and 11, so basically now it's already available. Yeah. All of our tests in core already run with user 1 turned off. This is huge because we used to run tests and they would go green, and then someone came along with like a use case that we have in test, and they're like, yeah, it's still broken. No, test go green, it's not broken. Yeah, it is. Turns out we were working with user 1, and user 1 has access to everything. So we were setting up permissions that we thought were correct, but were in fact incorrect. But our test would still run because user 1 would just bypass all access checks, right? So that was really nasty. The goal is to also have contrib tests run with user 1 disabled in the next major. We cannot do that now because everyone would be pissed off at me, probably rightfully so. And I don't want that. Well, honestly, I don't care. It's just that I don't like all the work that comes with it if everyone is pissed off at me. So we don't do that, right? But yeah, tests do that now. You can do that for your site. And if you happen to lock yourself out, just switch that flag again, clear your caches, and as user one, you will have full access again. That's how easy it is. That's how powerful the access policy API is. And a funny side note, because I think I'll have plenty of time anyways, funny side note is that someone came up to me earlier last week, I think, or the week before that, regarding the group module. And it turned out that they were only using one type of scope. And the other one was loading all of someone's memberships, and they had hundreds of memberships, and it was becoming really slow. So I asked them, are you ever going to be using the individual scoping group? No, they said. Okay, turn off that access policy. And it won't load all of your memberships again to check whether you need something in the individual scope. They're like, can I do that? Sure you can. So they turned it off. Instantly improved the performance of the entire website. That's really cool. So putting this all together, so now we have a system that can generate this list of permissions, can cache it, can vary it. So it's already like really cool, but we still have all of those places in core where we were checking for permissions, right? So how do we actually apply this to that? Well, one of the fastest issues to ever land in core with such an invasive change was the one that I did to centralize your permission checks. Everyone thought it was a great idea, so it immediately went in, and we have the permission checker in core now. It's a service, and it I fat fingered that one. And it basically has this has permission check where we call the access processor, you pass in the accounts, and then you call get item. Now get item seems a bit of voodoo, doesn't it? Because what is item? Well, this is again the thing with like the scopes and the identifiers. Out of the box, get item will ask for the item at the address of Drupal scope and Drupal identifier. So you don't need to specify that. So we made it exactly so that when you're working with Drupal core, it's actually quite simple to use these things, right? Get item will either return null or a calculated permissions object, calculated permissions item object for the Drupal scope. So either we have nothing, and then, well, we return that it's false, or we have an item, and then on that item, we call the has permission method. That's the one you saw earlier, where we check whether you're an admin or whether that permission is in your list of assigned permissions. So that's how that works. And now everything in core, whether it's current user has permission or user has permission or what have you, they all run through this centralized permission checker. So that's how we made that work. Now, scopes and identifiers. So this is where it gets really interesting and also like a huge mindfuck. So I hope that I'll be able to explain this correctly because I don't have that many slides on this topic. But everything I just told you, like everything, that whole thing that I just showed you, that all happens in the Drupal scope and Drupal identifier. And if you don't have like a specific identifier in the scope that you care about, it basically acts like bundles on entities. The user entity type has the user bundle. Why? Because users don't have bundles, so we don't care. So we just give it the same name for like the identifier. Whereas a node type has multiple bundles, like page, article, whatever. Why? Because we do care, right? So that's how that maps to like scopes and identifiers. The scope is basically the realm that you're in. And then the identifier, if you care about it, can be something specific. It can be an integer, it can be a string, it can be something specific. But if you don't care, you just give it the same name like the scope and it's fine. Everything I just showed you, what if I told you that that also works for, let's say, group 1? So you're using the group module, you're currently looking at the first group that was created. And as you may or may not know, in the group module, you can have permissions on a tiny level of your website inside a group. This whole system works for group. We just pass it a different scope. We pass it the group scope. We pass it the identifier 1. And this whole system also works there. If you're using the domain module and you're perhaps on the corporate domain where you want people to be able to do less than on testing, I don't know, good. Exactly the same. Everything I just talked about also works for the domain module. And they would specify a domain scope and then the machine name of whatever domain you're on. And it works like that all the way down. Like whatever you can imagine. Usually you don't need this. It's cool for modules that segment your website. Group does that. Domain does that. There's probably plenty of other modules that do that. if you segment your website and you want to have permissions within your segment, so not Drupal permissions that work everywhere, for instance, create page works everywhere, you can have a permission also perhaps called create page within a specific group and not be able to create pages anywhere else on the website because of this system. I invented this system for group. And then after like a couple of years, I was like, actually, this would be really cool in core. So then I got that sponsorship at DrupalCon Pittsburgh. Yeah. And it's Pittsburgh, but the contest was called Pittsburgh. So have fun with that one. And I lost. I was one of the top 10 or something. I can't recall that were presented by Dries. But the audience apparently hated the idea because I was number 7, I think. And only the top 6 got funded. And luckily for all of you, WordPress came in and they said, you know, we really like the first idea on that list. We're going to sponsor it, which freed up some money. And then it came down to me. I was basically the first loser. But it's really cool that, you know, that happened. So it's like, you know, a series of events like the butterfly effect. If I had not hated organic groups 11 years ago, we would not have Access Policy API in core right now. So it's like this whole domino effect. But anyway, so that's how that happened. I tend to go off on tangents like these, sorry. So essentially, if you want to do this, you need to create your own permission checker. And in that permission checker, you call the access policy processor. So that's the reusable part. You can call the access policy processor for your own scopes and identifiers. And then something happens and then profit. So how does that look in group? Now, this looks nasty, and it is. But that's just because in group, I have 3 scopes. Quickly, what are they? If you are not a member of a group and you have a specific Drupal role, we can give you permissions in all groups of a specific group type. Really useful if, for instance, you're an admin and you want to be able to administer all of the groups without manually having to join them. So you have the admin role on the Drupal side, you map that to a group role in the outsider scope, and that's how that works. Insider scope is the opposite. You have a Drupal role globally, and you are a member of certain groups, and in those groups, you get something. And then the individual scope in group is for like one group, not all groups of a type. It's basically like Bob is the teacher of a specific class, so in that class, but only that class, we want him to have the teacher role. That would go into the individual scope. So a group is probably like the most complex use case I could show here, but it's the only use case I can show here because that's the only module that currently was, you know, so involved with the Access Policy API. I'm hoping domain switches to it, or maybe even not, because I'm hoping that group and group sites replace domain access at one point, but like I don't have other examples. Now, I said you also need to write your custom permission checker, and that's essentially this. So what I just showed you was my calculator, because I can't call the access policy processor directly because I have 3 scopes, so I need to loop that in and merge that. And you'll see that over here I have chain calculator. That's the old name before it came into core. So now it's the access policy processor. And then I have my permission checker, and I have this method called has permission in group. And it looks very similar to has permission, except for the fact that we have a third argument, group. So inside that argument, we ask for the group. We go to my chain permission calculator, which I just showed you, sorry, the group permission calculator, to get that result, which has all 3 of your scopes. And then you'll notice something similar. We already saw this before in the permission checker in core. It's just that I do the same thing, but you can see now, instead of get item with nothing, I call get item with the individual scope and the ID of the group that we're interested in. And then if you have the permission in that group, we return true, and that's it. If you don't, we fall back to the insider and outsider scope, and we start checking your Drupal roles. And again, we get the item, depending on whether or not you're a member, and then we have that same logic. So that's how that works in the group module. So everything access related in group comes from core now. Well, will be when I release a new major, but it's the same code. It looks differently, but it's the same code. So that's how that works. And that's basically the end of it. I could give you a couple of examples of the cool stuff you can do with it, but before I waste all of my time, I wanted to give everyone time for questions. And at the same time, I'll show this QR code for like the review. I probably won't read them, but the like the organizers want me to mention this because they do care about like, you know, whether or not people enjoyed this talk. I honestly don't give a shit. I'm sorry. So yeah, thank you. So does anyone have questions? I see someone at the mic. Yes, hello.
You said at the beginning that you were replacing the system with something a little bit more general, which makes me wonder, could that more general system have other applications? And looking at your code, I started thinking about the system for deciding whether a file can be downloaded. It's hook file access, I think.
Yeah.
Have you thought about that? Could this be used to replace the current implementation of hook file access? And if it could be, should it be? Because that code is kind of complicated. And I'd sort of like to rip it out of Drupal core.
Yeah. So this system basically governs the permissions that you have. So anything that checks for a permission, this system will intervene in, so that you no longer have to find all of those places where a permission is checked. But it doesn't replace everything else, so to speak. For instance, in entity access, if you want to allow someone access to a published node, an unpublished node or not, you will still need to check that node's status, right? We cannot do that from the permissions, because then our set of permissions would have to know what the current status of that node is and everything. And as I mentioned, an access policy needs to work with globally available data. So with the file system, it's the same thing. Yeah, we could perhaps check every file in the system, but how do you translate that into permissions? That's really difficult. So while I agree that we could clean up that system, this is really meant to be a fast and lightweight processor, really, for all of your permissions. And then you can still, in the thing that you're talking about, check for permissions. But it's not designed to replace it. If I ever had the time or someone were to sponsor it, I would gladly look at the mess perhaps that we have right now with the file system and come up with something similar, but I don't think that this would be a great fit for that. To latch on to that question, for instance, some people are already asking me whether they can do something to a particular node with this system. Well, the answer is yes and no. Yes, you can, but then I sound like Obama now, but yes, you can, but you need to be able to get that node globally. So for instance, if that node were the front page, you could use the isFrontPage cache context, and then perhaps allow people to not edit the front page, but they can edit the other nodes on the system. So while they are on the front page, they would not have the edit node permission. While they are on any other page, they would have the edit node permission, so to speak. So you can work your way around it, but it always needs to be representable by a cache context. And I think with the file system, that might be really difficult. Does that answer your question sufficiently?
Yeah, thanks.
All right. I'm still willing to look at it, but you'd have to pay Factorial. Like, I mean, I want to fix all the things. It's just that I have no cloning device and there's only one of me. So.
He responded me as well.
Okay.
Oh, okay, cool.
In the alter phase, you mentioned that you could both remove and add.
Yes.
Are there use cases for adding there? Because that
Yes.
sounds like it reintroduces the problem you started with.
No, that's actually a great question, and there are use cases for that. So, as some of you may know, all of you should know because I said that in the opening slide, I maintain the group sites module. And in the group sites module, it's a module to allow you to turn whatever you configured in group into microsites. So that based on what domain you're on, for instance, we activate only one group. Or based on what path you're on, we activate only one group. Now, there's an optimization to be had, because if you have a lot of data in group, that can lead to some heavy queries. But if we know that you're on one group and one group only based on that global context, there's some really cool stuff that we can do. Because we could basically say, okay, let's grab all of the outsider permissions, all of the insider permissions, all of your individual permissions, and see which ones apply to the current group we're looking at. So what we do there is we basically remove everything that isn't for the current group. We flatten your outsider and insider permissions into the individual scope, and then we add that back into your permissions as the individual scope. It's like black magic. I don't know what I was drinking when I wrote that, but it works. And it leads to, yeah, I should get more of that because I wrote some really cool code. So yeah. But it leads to this use case where it does make sense to add something in the alter phase. It's very rare. The alter phase should mostly be used to remove stuff. But sometimes, once in a blue moon, you have this really cool edge case where it does make sense to add stuff. And it's mostly collecting stuff from other people and then doing some massaging, adding that back in after you removed it. So it does make sense. But you probably won't need it that much.
I see. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, I noticed with this calculate thing and then get item
Yeah.
that the calculate has to always get everything for all scopes. And if the website has a lot of scopes and you are a user, you're in every group or something, then is there a scaling issue that you first calculate everything before you refine it down?
Not necessarily, no. Like you can have an unlimited amount of access policies, but the thing is that each access policy is represented by a cache context, and by definition, this is me as the cache subsystem maintainer talking, cache context should be fast. You cannot be loading 1 million entities in your cache context to run some checks because they run perhaps on every page multiple times. So the return value should be fast. So this system is really designed with speed in mind. Now you mentioned that having like a large amount of scopes, I can almost guarantee that that will never be the case. Group has 3 scopes because it's so complex. Domain would have 1 scope. Core has 1 scope. If someone, that's like a wager I'm willing to make right now, if someone was ever to come to me with a website with more than 10 scopes, I would buy them a beer.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. I mean, if you have many groups, even if each group, so if you have 10 group IDs,
Yeah.
each one of them right now I was considering a scope, but it's not what you would say it's a scope.
It's an identifier within the individual scope.
Exactly, but then you would still have to map in this collection that you calculate, you would have to map this value for each group, right?
Yeah, but that's fine. That is just basically more data in a value object. That's perfectly fine. When it comes to checking that, it's also fine because if we go back to the checker that I had, you'll see that we basically grab one item, and on that one item, we check whether you have the permission. So if we're looking at group 5, we would be in individual ID, and then the number 5, we would always just grab one item. The fact that you have a large collection only comes into play when group is leveraging query access, because then we have to leverage all of them at once. Now, this is why I advise anyone using group nowadays to minimize how many people they give individual roles. You can get a lot done with insider and outsider roles, and as the gentleman behind you can confirm, if you put a lot of stuff in individual roles, then you might see performance issues, but that's normal. You're not supposed to use them that much. And you can even write your own access policies for group if you do have a use case where you can't fit everything in insider and outsider, and you have this use case, but using individual would lead to performance issues. That's what I advised them earlier this week. You can write your own access policy that basically does some magic itself, which is more performance specifically tailored toward your use case.
But this calculate permissions, would it reflect which groups I'm a member of? Let's say there's
Yes.
10,000 groups in a website, I'm 3,000 groups I'm a member, so there would be 3,000
Yes.
values in this
Yes.
calculate permissions object.
Yep.
But because it's cached, and it's
Yes.
kind of okay.
Yeah,
And-
it gets cached. And
okay.
if like there's a fat chance this happens, but if someone would happen to have the exact same 3,000 memberships as you do, then they would get your cached results.
Yeah, okay. But if you have like 1 million groups, and then at some point it's
If you have 1 million groups and and within those 1 million groups you have people who are members of all of them, your site will go down. You'll end up calling Factorial and begging for my help. And that's when I'll tell you, what have you done?
yeah. All right.
You really shouldn't do that. It's not that well documented, but you really shouldn't do that.
If you have that many groups, we would also be interested in your projects, because so far for us, I don't think this has been the source of our performance issues. We've had those nicely come from elsewhere. I had an unrelated question to this. You mentioned earlier that the current user global service was set to the user that permissions were being calculated for.
Yes.
can we start throwing a warning or exception if people actually use that service during the calculation? The reason I'm asking is I gave a talk this morning about async Drupal, where I could see
Oh,
a
yeah.
future use case where we might start calculating for multiple accounts at the same time. So if you use global state at that point, that's gonna mess things up.
Yeah. Okay, so two things. Async is a bit of like voodoo to me. I didn't
That's
make
fair.
it to your session, so it still is. Um, but I don't see the harm because like 99% of the time, the account that we're actually passing in is the current user.
Yeah.
It's like, I hated the fact that we have systems in core where we do something with a passing user account and we just slap on the user dot whatever cache context and expect it to work. It leads to like really extreme edge cases where we have to like with a paper bag over our heads tell them, oh yeah, shit, we shouldn't have done that. I wanted to avoid that. That's why it's in there. But 99.9% of the time it won't be the current user. And in those cases where it isn't, it should mostly be fine. If something were to happen during your access policy processor that basically makes the system like go haywire, we have this try catch finally surrounding it, and in the finally we always switch back. So we will never poison the current user with the wrong user, so to speak. It's just during the calling of your access policies we do swap it out.
Yeah. So I think for me it was mostly I'm seeing that the right thing for implementers to do is to use the account that they get passed
Yes.
in.
Yeah.
And we're gonna run into issues where there's global scope being used
Yeah.
and it shouldn't be. So I was just seeing here, like, if we're introducing this newly, can we prevent people from doing the wrong thing and force them to use what's passed in?
I think the solution here is more in the fact that we're still investigating how we can introduce cache contexts that work for passed-in data.
I see.
And,
Okay.
and once we fix that, then this won't be an issue because we'll replace user roles with whatever we cook up then.
Okay,
So
cool.
right now it's something we have to live with, but it might become an issue when async becomes something like real, and then our hands will be forced and we'll have to accelerate that whole process where we think about cache context for passed-in data.
Okay, cool. That's good to add to the list. Thanks.
Yeah. So I think I'm already out of time, but is it fine if I take one more question? Yeah, okay, cool.
Okay. Thank you for the talk and thank you for the access policy API. I think this relates somehow with the variation cache.
Yes, it does.
And could you elaborate a little bit, because I was reading that the variation cache allows to introduce cache context on things that are not render arrays.
Yeah.
But the documentation is talking about something like a redirection on the cache or something like this, and I couldn't understand very well. So if you could elaborate, would be nice.
Yeah, so first of all, I did a whole talk about this earlier this year at DrupalCon Ghent. It's recorded. I would really recommend anyone interested in it to watch that recording. But in a nutshell, and how do you put variation cache in a nutshell? That's going to be a big-ass nutshell. But in a nutshell, we used to have the render cache, and on render arrays, you could specify cache contexts. Now, you would always have your initial render array with a bunch of cache contexts, like, let's say, user roles, yeah? But then other people can add to your render array, whether it's via hook form alter or whatever, they could add things, and those things could also vary by stuff. So that's where we had to invent cache redirects. So the initial state is that we look at the cache contexts that are initially there. We ask those cache contexts what their value is currently, and we dump those values into the string that becomes your cache ID. So it's basically a glorified cache ID generator. That's how it works. But then, under certain circumstances, let's say if you have a particular configuration of roles, someone might add some more to that render array, but only under those circumstances. And then that piece might vary by, let's say, their username. Who knows, right? So then how do we represent that? Well, it's quite simple. If you're in one of those configurations of roles where it didn't matter, we directly store the outcome of that render array at the address of those cache contexts being turned into a cache ID. But if we notice, and this is what the variation cache does for you, that at one point under another configuration of roles, we now have like an extra variability, That's where we store a cache redirect with the cache context of that variability. So now we're saying at this address where you have these roles, we actually need to vary by your username. Well, we can't store an outcome at that address because it's going to be for just one user. So what we do instead is we store this cache redirect value object, which says, do another cache get. Grab whatever cache context we had initially, add the ones that are on this cache redirect, and turn that into a cache ID. And look at that address. If you find something, cool. Now you have the outcome that was previously calculated. If you don't find something, we'll have to calculate it and we'll store it at that address. Calculated permissions work in the exact same way. Our initial cache contexts are the one that we gather from each access policy, the ones that you saw me specify in the examples. But it could be that within the build method, the build permissions method of your access policy, you vary by something else. And that access, that cache context won't always be necessarily, applicable, only in certain configurations. That's where the variation cache would also find that and trigger a redirect and take care of it. So basically, I needed variation cache for group. It was in core as a render cache. I saw that everyone, even dynamic page cache, was just dumping value objects into a render array, pulling that through the renderer, and going like, yeah, that's it. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to do that shit. So that's why I wrote the variation cache, got it into core after years, and that's why we now have this nice system, which actually works better than what we used to have, but is now reusable without, could you imagine that we had this entire new system, and then at the end of it, we were like, okay, so now we have this calculated permissions object, let's turn that into a render array. Yeah, that would be awful, so that's why we don't do that anymore. But yeah, I know the session description said that I would briefly touch on variation cache. I kind of didn't, sorry about that, but at least now we did. Watch that session. It was this year, DrupalCon Ghent, and I went into full detail.
Okay, thank you.